Hey everybody, it's great to be back with you. Pastor Bartley here. Thanks for your prayers while I was away. I'm back from quarantine, my travel quarantine, so it's really great to be back. We're doing some neat stuff during this series, White Flag, and we hope that you're enjoying it. We hope that you're diving right into it, that you've started your kind of Lent commitments this week, and that things are off to a good start. I appreciate Pastor Wade starting the series last Sunday, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what God's going to do through this series about surrender. You know, surrender really isn't something that the world values. You know, we say things like, never surrender, right? We sing songs about this. I'm not going to sing this morning. But, you know, politicians even live by the idea that you just never admit that you're wrong. Never. You just never do that. And chances are, when you actually heard the theme for this series, you probably didn't get all that excited about it. You know, it's not like a series about how to live your best life or how to be everything that you dreamed to be, right? Our society is all about getting the absolute most out of life. It's about taking control of your life. So we talk about surrender, and you're like, surrender? It sounds like something that losers do. It's like you couldn't make it in the business world, so now you're into voluntary simplicity, right? You're giving up on your dreams. You're checking out. You're settling. That's just the worst that you could think of. So I feel like before we even get into the guts of this series, I need to take a little bit of time and just sell you on the purpose of surrender. Because unless you actually see a purpose for it, you're going to fail to see its value. Now remember, we're talking about surrender to God, as Pastor Wade said last week. It's about getting on the right side. It's about allowing God to call the shots in my life. And today, I want you to see that there are some clear purposes and values for doing this. So our title today for week 2 is The Purpose of Surrender. The first thing I want you to see today is that surrender puts us in a healthy position in relation to God. You know, there's something incredibly healthy about acknowledging that, first of all, there is a God and that you are not him, right? You are not him. And that's actually a really good thing to acknowledge. It keeps everything in its proper place, everywhere where it should be. You know, when I was young, children were taught not to get out of line, right? In other words, we were taught that children had a certain place in relation to their parents and to other adults. And it meant that they were on a different level than you were. And you understood that as a child. Today, things have changed a lot. I think many parents today live with sort of a democratic style of parenting where every voice in the family is equal. And it's too bad because I think it's a philosophy that really fails to distinguish between the intrinsic value of a person and then also just practical value. See, obviously, children are intrinsically of the same value as us. They have the same value and worth as adults. But the truth is, their voice isn't of the same value because they lack wisdom. They lack experience. They lack perspective. That's why we don't let them vote until a certain age, right? There's reasons why we do that. And you know, I think this philosophy can be very damaging to kids. I see kids interacting with adults, failing to show proper respect and having really no concept of the fact that they know very little relative to the adults to whom they are speaking. And guys, I really think it sets them up for failure. They act inappropriately around adults because they've never really been taught to, you know, respect their elders. In fact, I've seen many kids actually demanding that adults respect them. And most adults, as a result, you know what? They just kind of write them off as arrogant little fill in the blank, right? Guys, I say the same dynamic is in play when we fail to see ourselves properly in relation to God. In Job chapter 38, you may know the story. After Job and his friends did all of their philosophizing and, you know, took themselves as being God's judge, basically, for 37 chapters, God finally has enough, and he speaks up. Look at what he says in Job 37, the beginning of that chapter. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. He said, 'Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand.'" And God rips into Job with a 75-question grilling. Halfway through that grilling, Job actually tries to apologize, and God basically says, "Whoa, shut up, I'm not finished yet." And he continues on and just riddles him with question after question. At the end of the whole thing, in Job chapter 42, Job very meekly responds back finally when God gives him the opportunity to speak. Job humbly says, you asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak. I will question you, and you shall answer me. My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Guys, Job finally saw himself in his proper place as it relates to God. Guys, we need to understand God is not beholden to us. He owes us no answers. And so note, whenever we fail to see ourselves in our proper place in relation to God, we're really living in denial. We're living in denial. You know, there was a great op-ed piece in the National Post just this past Friday. Conrad Black, who's a writer that I really appreciate, wrote this. He says, by debasing religion, Canadian intellectuals are playing a dangerous game. He says under that, the overwhelming slant of intellectual comment, and certainly media comment, is that religion is an outworn concept that has been reduced to the status of mere superstition or habit. He was actually addressing in this article the mistreatment of a young man named Jonathan Bradley, who's a fourth-year student at Ryerson, who was actually kicked out of his student newspaper for his beliefs. And Black goes on to say, if the informal coalition of militant and merely dismissive atheists and anti-theists actually stamps out official toleration of godliness and spirituality, it will create a vacuum that humans cannot resist the temptation to occupy. Conrad Black's a very brilliant individual, and he goes on to discuss how in ancient societies the practice was to actually elevate human beings to the status of being God, almost always with disastrous results. Guys, look at the things that we bow down to today. The people, particularly, like athletes, movie stars, musicians. We've bought into their moral standards as well, and really some of their ridiculous ideology. Conrad Black actually says in this article that Canadians, more than most nationalities, are becoming absurd. Absurd, and you may be feeling that sometimes. Guys, listen, there is a God. We are not him. And he has standards. And if we're wise, we will surrender to him and to his ways. See, surrender acknowledges God's authority. It acknowledges that God is the designer, that he is the creator, that he wrote the instruction manual. Surrender acknowledges God's wisdom. It acknowledges that he's smarter than me. And I need to look to him for wisdom when I lack it. The Apostle James spoke about that. And surrender also acknowledges God's power, that he's stronger than me, and that I need to look to him for strength and solutions when I don't have the solutions that I need in my life. And so surrender puts us in a healthy position in relation to God. That's the first thing you need to know today. The second one is this, and that is that surrender gives us spiritual power. You know, surrendering to God is the key to having spiritual power. Now, what do I mean spiritual power? Well, it's power in the spiritual realm in ways that are unseen. We could list a bunch of things: faith, courage, perseverance, forgiveness, inspiration, creativity, vitality, integrity, all these unseen things that are really foundational to our lives. You know, the Apostle Paul discovered that when he was weakest in his life, God was actually strongest in his life. We know that he once prayed 3 times for God to take away an infirmity that he was wrestling with. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, look at his response to that. When God didn't give him what he was looking for, he says, God said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Guys, we live in a day and age when everyone wants to be the strong, independent type, right? The one who does it their way, in their own strength, so that they can boast in their own accomplishments. Everyone wants to be successful and powerful, kind of like the Korean boy band BTS. Now, you guys familiar with this group? You know, we want to be able to flaunt our accomplishments before we drop the mic, right? That's how we are today. I don't want to pick on BTS. I actually kind of think it's cool that a Korean band has risen to such, levels. And I also wanted you to know that I actually know about young bands like this, but I actually don't know very much at all. But a lot of people have actually been saying that this band, they're kind of becoming a little bit arrogant, but it just goes along with how we all are as human beings, right? We crave that sort of power and we become arrogant about it. But this sort of power, guys, it's vain and it's empty. There's nothing really to it. The Bible shows us over and over that God is on the side of the weak and the poor. The prophet Samuel's mother Hannah knew this, and you may remember this from the series that we just did on 1st and 2nd Samuel. Hannah said this, God raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. The Apostle James also reminded us that God gives grace to the humble, but he resists the proud. Did you hear that, guys? Listen, think about this. Surrender unlocks God's grace in your life. That's what it does. I decided a long time ago that it was better to be humble and mediocre than arrogant and amazing. Now, I'm not amazing, but I figured out a long time ago, if I had to choose between those two, I would rather be humble and mediocre, because without God working through me, I can do nothing of eternal value. Jesus taught that. And God comes alongside of those who are humble. He gives grace to the humble. I pity many of you watching here today because I think you are chasing tangible versions of success. And you know what? Many of you are succeeding at it. As the world relates to success, you're doing very well. But you may be overlooking the true invisible versions of success. You haven't necessarily surrendered to God's ways. Your life doesn't demonstrate surrender as God describes it. And someday when you're stricken with anxiety or a loved one dies unexpectedly or you become sick, guys, you know what? None of your trophies of success are going to be able to help you. You will lack the spiritual power that it takes to overcome these kinds of obstacles. And your life is going to be like that house that Jesus described, that the foolish man built on the sand, right? The waves are going to come and the wind, and it's going to fall with a great crash. And it's going to be too late then to realize that surrender would have brought you spiritual power to sustain you during those storms of life. The third thing you need to know about surrender and its purpose is that surrender allows us to accomplish God's work. Now, what do I mean when I say God's work? There's a lot of ways we could describe that. Let me sort of boil it down to three things here today. Let's say resisting sin, doing good, and sharing the good news would be three things that we could really focus on. As it relates to the first one, resisting sin, it says in Romans chapter 6, the Apostle Paul, he says, do not let any part of your body become an instrument of evil to serve sin. Instead, give yourselves completely to God. For you were dead, but now you have new life. So use your whole body as an instrument to do what is right for the glory of God. In the King James Version, the word that's used there is the word yield. It's the Greek word peristemi, which is actually a combination of two words, which means to stand or place beside. And it's actually a really beautiful picture of surrender. It's not about giving up. It's not about running away. It's not about laying down. It's about standing to the side. It's about standing there and allowing God to go first in your life. And Paul taught that we always yield ourselves to something in our life. It's going to be to our own desires or someone else's desires, or it's going to be to God. And when we surrender to God, we are saying no to our own desires and we're saying yes to God's desires. We say no to sin and selfishness, and we say yes to God's good ways. So surrender is what gives us the power to resist our own sinful desires. The second thing that we see here is doing good, right? Surrender is about doing good, and surrendering to God is also the key to doing good in the world. Surrender allows us to value God's eternal things over the world's temporary things. It allows us to de-emphasize ourselves and to focus on what really matters. Guys, here's a fact. You can take this to the bank. Until you surrender to God, your life will always be mostly about you. It will. You will have spurts of doing good, but you will constantly revert back to serving yourself unless you've truly surrendered to God. And this is why this is so important. The third thing I would share here is about sharing the good news. And a big part of the work of God is to tell people about Jesus and his love. It's to let them know that Jesus is God's solution for our sin, for our pain, for our suffering, for everything that's wrong in the world. And Jesus' death on the cross was payment for the sins of mankind. It was God throwing open his arms to all of us and offering us forgiveness and offering us a future together with him. It's really the greatest message the world has ever seen or heard, and that's why we share it so much at Renew Church. And Jesus has called his followers to surrender their lives in order to share that message with other people. The things that we are doing, really, they're not nearly as important when we really analyze them. And the Apostle Paul, he understood this, and he made himself God's slave to share this message. We know in reading the New Testament, Paul risked his life on many, many occasions in order to take this message to new groups of people. This was the scripture that we read this morning that Paul says in relation to this. He says, though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Guys, this sounds very foreign to Christians today. You know, to go to all of these ends like Paul did, to take the message of the good news to other people. You know, I'm afraid, guys, that we are afraid today to speak up lest we be mocked. There's a lot of pressure out there against Christians and Christian ideals. Sometimes I think we're afraid. Guys, we need to choose to become God's slaves as well, just like Paul did, and to surrender ourselves, to surrender to being messengers of the gospel. So let's review here this morning. We said surrender puts us in a healthy position in relation to God. Secondly, surrender gives us spiritual power. This is what it does. Thirdly, it allows us to accomplish God's work, whether that's resisting sin, doing good, or sharing the good news with other people. And finally, I want to end with number 4 today, and that is that surrender brings freedom and peace to us. If there's one thing that I see lacking in people's lives today, I would sum it up in one word. It's the word peace. People are just so stressed out today. They're full of anxiety. They're on edge. You know, and we look around, we see evidence of it. Children are cutting themselves. Adults are medicating themselves with alcohol. We all seem to be using way more medication, more drugs than we used to. And I ask myself, what's going on? What's happening in our world? And I have to ask this question. Let me just throw it out there, guys. Is it possible that we're serving a cruel master? Is this possible? You know, Paul already established that we need to serve someone. We know that this is true. He made himself a slave to Christ so that he wouldn't become a slave to someone else or to his own evil desires. You know, the old saying is true. We're going to serve somebody. Guys, some of you, you know what? You're going to serve the unrealistic expectations of your parents. Maybe you've been doing that. Maybe you're coming to discover, wow, I just can't satisfy them. Some of you are serving a boss that is only going to keep taking advantage of you more and more as you let them do that. You think, oh, this is going to result in something good. No, they're just taking advantage of you more and more and more. You're serving a cruel master. Some of you, you know what? You're serving your own endless goals of perfection, that Instagram vision that you have of your life. And it is a cruel master. It is putting so much pressure on you. It is making you so miserable and so unhappy. Imagine this, guys. Just imagine this. What would it be like if you only had one person to follow, one voice to direct you, one person to please in your life, one person who you knew loved you enough to give you the perfect amount to do for today, and that's it? Wouldn't that be an amazing thing? Doesn't that sound like a beautiful scenario? It would take so much pressure off, having to worry about pleasing this person or that person or whoever. You know what? This is exactly what Jesus is proposing. In Matthew chapter 11, look at what he says. He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Guys, a yoke is a symbol of surrender. You know, it means that you're locking yourself to one other individual. I grew up in the Maritimes where we had, ox pulls and horse pulls and stuff. This was entertainment where I grew up. And you would see the oxen with this yoke, and they would be bound to another animal, usually a younger animal with a older, more experienced animal that would kind of pull alongside of them and with them. And this image of a yoke, when we think of that as people and what Jesus is talking about, it can sound very scary and very limiting. But what if that was actually the key to finding the most freedom and peace in your life? What if? Jesus asks us to join him in his yoke. What if he's actually trying to protect us from trying to do more than we were designed to do? Have you ever thought about that? Maybe that's what's going on. Guys, maybe we have been looking at surrender all wrong in our lives. Maybe it's not at all about losing. Maybe it's about giving ourselves the biggest opportunity for success. The top performers in every domain of life will tell you that at a certain point, they had to surrender to a coach who knew more than they did. I'm a pretty big tennis fan. I like sports in general. Tennis is kind of big right now because the Australian Open has been going on. The men's finals of the Australian Open actually happened today. It's Djokovic and Medvedev. It should be a great match. You know what, guys? Every year, the Australian Open shines a light on one specific individual because all of the hopes of the nation get piled onto the back of the Aussie Nick Kyrgios. Now, if you follow tennis, you will know that Kyrgios is, by everyone's account, the greatest combination of natural talent and also lack of discipline on the ATP Tour. He is tall, he is strong, he is fast, he's creative. He's actually a very winsome person, a very generous person. But now in his 10th season, he has yet to make it even to the finals of a Grand Slam tournament. Nobody would have predicted this when he started out. He had so much talent. This year, the Australian lost in 5 sets to Dominic Thiem, the Austrian, in the 3rd round. And here's the kicker, here's the worst part. He was actually up 2 sets to love in that match. Thiem came back and won 3 sets to beat him. Guys, honestly, I'm hoping that this will be a turning point for Kyrgios in his career. Last summer, one of Kyrgios' most vocal critics said that it would be a no-brainer to start coaching him if he was open to it. And I'm talking about my all-time favorite tennis player, John McEnroe. For those that grew up in the 80s, you remember John McEnroe. You know what? After the 2016 US Open, McEnroe actually said, he called out Nick Kyrgios. He said, Nick, if you don't want to be a professional tennis player, do something else. He actually came right out and said that through the airwaves. But here's the thing, guys. McEnroe has also been really open about his belief in Nick's potential. In fact, just this past spring, McEnroe called Kyrgios the most talented player outside of the big 3 of Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, and Novak Djokovic, admitting that he would be tempted to coach the Aussie star. Here's what he said. He said, of course I'd be tempted, he told Sports Sunday. He'd be like a no-brainer. If it worked out, it would be incredible. And for those who watched McEnroe in his day, he was basically the pre-incarnation of Kyrgios, passionate and often out of control. But here's the thing. He knew how to win. He figured out how to win. He won 7 Grand Slams. Guys, here's the thing. Listen, what Nick Kyrgios needs more than anything right now is a yoke. He needs a coach. He needs a master. He needs someone to take control of him and his game. Someone to help him do what he doesn't want to do so that he can become what he's always wanted to become. And guys, for the rest of this series, that's the image that I want you to lock into your head as it relates to surrender. The image of a yoke. And I want you to acknowledge that surrender has a purpose in your life. It has a very important purpose.